This week on Buffering, we're joined by Frank Ploumen, Senior Vice President of Product Line Leadership here at Calix. Frank oversees product strategy across our entire cloud platform, and he sits at the intersection of every major technology decision we're making as a company. Man, it's a big job, Frank. From network operations to customer experience to AI. And Frank has been raising a concept that really resonated with us around this idea of AI orphans. And these are AI investments that work in isolation but can't scale. And Frank believes they're becoming one of the biggest hidden risks in telecom and Frank, I think really business in general. And today we're going to unpack what AI orphans are, why they happen, and what leaders should be doing about it. But first, Frank, welcome to Buffering, man. We're so happy to have you on.
Yeah, welcome.
Yeah, thanks for having me, guys.
Yeah, really appreciate it. Well, I'll hand it to Zack. I know he's got a couple of questions that he wants to jump into straight away, and then, as you know, we keep this a conversational, thing. So we'll bounce back and forth around a bunch of topics today.
Gabe,
Awesome.
and we'll kick things off with one of my favorite subjects of the past few years. Gabe, I actually saw today that I think it was ChatGPT kind of launched publicly in 2022. And if you can believe it, that's 4 years ago now. It seems like it was just 1 or 2, and things have just exploded since. But that aside, Frank, as we get into this concept of AI orphans, let's set the stage a little bit. What do you see driving telecom providers to experiment with AI right now? And where do you see them seeing pressure from? Is it from their customers, from their competition? Where is this pressure coming from an AI perspective?
Well, I think it's an pressure in general in the industry, right? Like you can't open the news every day and you see the wonderful things one can do with AI. You see crazy new use cases. Everybody's running 1,000,000 miles an hour. Right. So it is only natural that every business leader is looking at this and said, well, wait a minute, like we're falling behind. We need to go faster. Right. So I think it's just a sign of the times. And like we'll get deeper into that. But we've seen this movie before. We had a similar kind of dynamic in the market 10, 15 years ago with IoT. Right. Everybody had to jump in IoT. Right. And I'll make a few comparisons about that. And I think what you're going to see is that AI is wonderful. AI is going to do fantastic things for our industry and many others. But there is a way to go about it to make it long-term sustainable.
And within a communication service provider, where do you see the most enthusiasm today? Is it in the network ops, customer service, field tech, marketing? Where do you kind of see the most excitement, or is it everywhere at once?
Well, there's a lot of use cases that we started to look at. Actually, so many that it's actually hard to keep track of them. So we started organizing them in outcomes, right? It's easier to think of use cases in outcome categories. And there's essentially 4 outcomes that we saw in the industry that are distinctly different, right? And if you highlight them, like one has to do with customer acquisition. How do I find new customers for my business? Service providers have a network and you need to feed it with as many subscribers as you can. So that requires a set of intelligence, lookalike modeling, smart campaigning, not just try to target everybody, because that's a very wasteful way of doing customer acquisition. The second category has everything to do with upsell, cross-sell and upsell. So if you have a subscriber, how do you create more lifetime value? How do you do more ARPU upsell? Which means you need to understand unmet needs. What does Frank want at home? What does Gabe want? Why would I pay more for my service? Well, it needs to be material and driving value for me, right? So a lot of use cases around understand the subscriber, understand the unmet needs, understand the points of friction, and then convert that into targeted upsell, right? A third category has everything to do with understanding what would drive somebody away from your platform. Right. So how do you mitigate churn, which comes down to, again, understand unmet needs, but now also understand friction in the platform, understand all the dynamics that go into a potential decision for a subscriber to abandon, right? Which is a very expensive decision for a service provider. Lifetime value for a subscriber that's loyal is very high. Right. And then the fourth category is an umbrella of topics that have to do with just optimizing the cost to deliver service. So what can you do for call centers? What can you do in the network operations center to just automate troubleshooting, deflect calls, automate like resolution, right? And provisioning, upgrades, everything that takes a lot of manual steps today that agentic workflows for sure can streamline. So those are the four categories we see. Within those four categories, the number of use cases is almost endless, right? So that's why we started to just categorize them in those four big buckets of outcome.
I like those categories a lot, and it reminds me of a phrase I use in a lot of customer meetings, which is there are basically three ways to make money in this business. You can get more customers, you can get those customers to buy more or different things, and you can keep the customers that you have. And those three big concepts or buckets that you went through at the beginning of that fall really nicely into each one of those three categories. And one of the other things that I do think is interesting is Frank, I know you have a lot of meetings with customers as well. Zach and I do also. But one of the things that has been frequently coming up in those conversations is the impulse to experiment. And I get excited about experimentation as it relates to AI. I know Zach and I talk about this a lot. And I do think it's probably the right move. Nobody's going to criticize a team for trying to use AI and increase efficiencies of a particular product, or a particular solution. But is there a difference between what you define as a good start and a problematic start when it comes to these experiments?
Yeah. So first, I would agree with you. Experimenting is recommended. Experimenting is important, I would say. This world is moving very fast, and if you don't experiment, it's really hard to go from a theory to a successful kind of business and implementation if you don't experiment in the middle, right? You have to validate your assumptions. Where I think a good experiment turns into a bad start is if that experiment that was designed to prove out an assumption or test and validate a set of uncertainties in your strategy turns into code that you deploy that is a one-off that is hard to maintain, right? And what we see in telecom is a very complex beast. Everything is interconnected. It's to some extent the biggest machine in the world because everything is dependent and interacting with each other. If you deploy assets in your operational network that are one-offs, they become very hard to maintain. Right. And then it becomes a long-term burden, right? So the experiment was a good thing, but if you don't have a long-term strategy in how to maintain, how to upgrade, how to drive consistency, right, you end up slowing down your overall business in the long run because you have so much burden and so many touch points that you need to maintain to upgrade a service.
Yeah, it's a very fair point. You've inserted complexity into that process by trying to do something and make it simpler. That's very fair. Can you give us a real life example? You don't have to name names, obviously, but can you tell us maybe an example of what you've seen somebody doing a problematic start and what that looked like?
So say, for example, if you want to implement a chatbot to reduce your call center load or even to deflect calls, right? One can imagine if you start playing with some tools, right? You open Claude, you start downloading some tools and start playing. You can build a pretty powerful chatbot, probably fairly quick, right? The problem now is you have a chatbot. If that chatbot is not plugged into your operational backend system, your OSS, your BSS, the way that it converts, it is just a chatbot. Right. And it might have been optimized to solve a few problems, maybe a reset password on your Wi-Fi or take another 3-4 problems. But ultimately, you deploy this thing. And when it's time to grow, when it's time to roll out new services, when it's time to deal with more complex problems, this system is not integrated with the backend systems that you need for more complex problems. Mm-hmm. So now you end up building chatbot number 2, right? And that one is going to solve a different problem. And now you need something that orchestrates between these two, depending on the question that is asked. And you can see this kind of escalate and blow up, right? Mm-hmm. It's a very obvious trap that people can fall for, right? And like, if you want to make quick progress, the temptation, of course, is high to just, let's not slow down, let's go, right? The world is moving fast. Like I could save money today and drive a higher experience right? But you need to watch for that trap because you will end up hitting a wall where you can't go any further because it's a point solution. It's not properly integrated with all your backend systems.
Yeah, very fair point.
And one of the kind of big topics we want to talk about today is the AI orphans we mentioned here at the beginning of the podcast. Frank, you've been using this term quite a bit. Can you explain to our listeners what this means in plain terms? What exactly is this AI orphan, and how do you know when you've created one?
So first of all, like I can't take any credit for the term. Somebody mentioned the term, so I don't want to brag about that. But somebody
We
mentioned
would
the
have
term,
given it to you.
Yeah, we would have given you full
uh,
credit, Frank. It's fine.
like what I liked about it is it immediately resonated because it describes this whole idea of a dead end point solution so well, right? It's like
Mhm.
you can build a point solution to solve a short term problem extremely fast, right? Even become a hero in your organization and say, like, look what I did, look at these efficiency gains, right? But ultimately, the judgment call I would make is basically, have you thought about what happens next, right? Like if you start to look forward to fast forward a year, 2 years, 3 years in your business, like where does this go? Right? Who's maintaining it? Who's integrating it? Who's upgrading it? Who's keeping it up to date with an ever evolving network? Right? And that is probably more important than anything in telecom. Remember, like this is the one industry that is backwards compatible 100 years to a telephone that you could pick up out of a museum and it still works.
Yeah,
Right. So
such a great point.
unfortunately, we have a really tough industry for just saying like, well, we'll just deprecate that and we don't look at it anymore. Right. There is no such thing as pure greenfield. Everything has a backwards compatibility burden.
I always think about that when we're talking about like new GigaSpire appliances and things like that. And it's like, well, how many POTS ports does this have? And I go like, my goodness, are we still talking about POTS ports? But to your point, everything kind of has to be backwards compatible.
I don't.
Well,
I
you
don't
can
think there's
pick
a
up
POTS
something
port
out
in
of
my
a
house.
museum, plug it in, and it still works. It's an insane concept that I can design something in 2026 and then pick up a telephone in a museum and it should still work. But yes, that's the industry we work with.
Yeah.
Uh, but back to your question, how do you know you built one? I think you need to ask those critical questions of basically like not just does it solve the problem that I was looking for, but basically if I extrapolate in my larger business, where could this go? And do I have an operational model and a development model and a support model to get there? You don't need to do everything day one, but if you build a chatbot to stay with the original example for password resets and a few questions, one can very quickly forward to how does this become the primary interface for solving any support question? And
Mhm.
if you do so, like how does it interface with critical systems in workforce management and ticketing and billing that all become critical components to solve problems that interface needs to solve?
Yep. I that makes a lot of sense, and I appreciate that perspective. I think we're bouncing around a couple of terms here that I think are very similar, but I'd love to have you explain maybe some subtle differences here. And these are point solutions versus bolt-on solutions. Can you talk us through kind of each one? Maybe we start with point solutions and kind of what some of those subtle differences are between a point solution versus a bolt-on.
But we talk like let me start here. Like if you want to be the most effective you can get in automation, you need to think through end-to-end business operations, right? The rate limiting step in a business. So what I mean with that is like I can get very efficient, let's say in manufacturing or in finance or in sales or in marketing. But the rate limiting step ultimately is not going to be within your department where you've done a great job to optimize. It's going to be across departments, right? Because how do we operate in a company today? Well, actually, any any decision needs to get made that impacts multiple departments typically comes down to people, humans, a meeting, right? All that automation we did turns into a report that spits out a graph that we put on a PowerPoint and then we all debate it. Right. And then it's good old debating that basically makes a decision. Yeah, that makes financial sense. We should do this. Or no, we shouldn't do this and that. So the point I'm making here is the rate limiting step in information is often across vertical departments, right? And the reason I make that point is like if you start optimizing a point solution, till some extent, you can say a point solution is something you optimize within one department, right? It's a very easy start in the sense that I don't have many stakeholders. I can make decisions within my own team. I don't need to rally the whole company around it. There's no complicated governance, right? So I can go really fast, but I'll ultimately get stuck within, okay, within my department, I've optimized something. And now in order to go to the next step to optimize the whole business, I need to take that super optimized output and go debate it in a meeting with humans back to get it back into the next point solution where somebody starts analyzing, say, yeah, we can do that, or no, that doesn't work. Right. So that for me is the ultimate definition of a point solution. If it doesn't orchestrate, if it doesn't handle complex federation of trust across multiple stakeholders, right, then it ultimately is going to get itself stuck within the vertical in which it was born. If that makes sense.
Totally makes
So,
sense.
yeah, and basically here what we have is, finance builds an agentic workflow, operations builds something else for their team, engineering builds their own thing as well. And everything may work, but they're totally isolated. And Gabe, we've heard this called these vertical pillars that don't talk to each other. Frank, is that kind of what you're seeing here as well?
Yeah, exactly. That's exactly what we see here is, and we saw this in our own department, right? So my team manages does the product management for all of Calix's products, right? So we do a lot of product definition, prototyping, uh, advanced concepts, and so on. And we started to find tools to make that faster and better, just like everybody else. But if the output of my tool is ultimately back a set of screenshots and wireframes that I drop in a document that somebody needs to read and basically manually edit and then try to replicate with another tool, then I've created a massive bottleneck in the transfer from my team to the engineering team. Whereas the optimal thing would be, of course, in my case, I build a prototype. I use advanced tools to simulate experiences, test them out with customers. And rather than hand over a document or a PDF or a picture, I hand over working code in a prototype. I said, here's the front end. Here's what I want it to look like. Now go build the back end code behind it. Right. So that's a much more powerful transfer of knowledge than to just spit out, okay, my job is done. I told you what to build, but somebody now needs to do all this work to replicate what I've already done.
Yeah. It's such an interesting point, and I think it just to take a little bit of a tangent here for a moment. This whole idea of how product marketing, product development is going to change going forward, I think is a really interesting discussion, because I love this idea of, product managers being more of builders, frankly, and, building these prototypes to actually hand off to somebody rather than, hey, I've built this Figma wireframe. That's great. But, I think if we're going to see AI really positively impact the development cycle, it needs to be with product managers who are building these prototypes and then handing them off to the development team. And if you look at, the companies right now that are being really successful from a development perspective and, really rapidly rolling changes out to their organizations, it's because their product managers have taken on that role. So anyway, I don't mean to totally diverge from this conversation. I just think it's a really interesting topic.
Yeah, and the other thing to keep in mind there is if you look at our industry at large, right? What sets aside, what creates differentiation in service providers today? It's the experience you create, right? Whereas in the past it used to be speeds and feeds, right? And I always compare this with the car industry, right? In the 80s, a good car had like 100 horsepower or something like that, and then it had 150, and then it had 200 and 250. The point there being is more horsepower is a better car, drives better. And then we got to the point where cars have stupid amounts of horsepower, and it kind of really doesn't make for a better car, whether it has 300, 400, 500, 800 horsepower. You can't use it anyway, right? Now, some people love muscle cars, and there's nothing wrong with that. But you get to the point where more horsepower doesn't make a better car, right? Per se. And we got there with the telecom industry as well, right? Back in the days, like a 1 meg, 3 meg DSL service was way better than something that was half the speed. You could feel the experience different when you're browsing the web. Fast forward to fiber, well, it is so fast that you can't really distinguish on raw speed. So now experience becomes the critical differentiator in driving a good service, which makes this design process of developing the best possible experience even more important.
Yeah, no doubt. Hey, you're preaching our language there, Frank. We talk about that all the time, man, and moving away from that speed and price-based approach, which is just really hard to differentiate in such a competitive market there. I do want to shift gears back to this bolt-on approach that we talked about
Yeah.
just a moment ago as well. And it sort of ties nicely into the comment that you made a few moments ago around, you know, the legacy platforms and systems that still need to be supported. But layering AI onto those legacy systems may feel like the path of least resistance for a lot of providers, but why do you think that that's such a dangerous approach with this bolt-on strategy?
Well, I think what you're going to end up with is could you build a bolt-on to a legacy platform and then route any kind of workload to an LLM in the cloud? Of course, it can be done, right? It's not that hard to do. You would end up with a platform that can't intelligently distinguish between what you can solve in deterministic algorithms versus what you should actually route to an agentic workflow. You end up with token cost, right? Because the platform doesn't natively support this type of workload, right? So you're going to add it on, which means it's going to drive cost per token, which then means you need to go charge to a service provider a set of tokens without necessarily knowing how much outcome is generated for those tokens, right? And if there's one thing I learned over time is people hate paying an input if they don't know if the output will create a dividend, right? It's the one lesson you learn up front is like you align your cost structure to an output, right? Because then it's a no-brainer. It's like, hey, if you make $10, I'm going to charge you $1 and here's my cost. Yeah, that makes sense. But just to charge me N tokens for a support call, and I don't know if it solves anything, that is very dangerous.
Yeah,
And
that's actually a good point.
one last thing on this topic here. These AI orphans, they can actually generate what we call a win, right? So departments go out,
Yep.
they celebrate them, but how do you convince someone that their win wasn't actually created by creating a problem that they can't yet see?
Well, it's tough, right? Because like if somebody is set up to go solve a point problem and they're empowered to solve a point problem and nobody in the larger organization is looking at the bigger picture, then they're doing what they're told to do and they're celebrating their success, right? And the reason I'm so focused on this is I've seen this movie in IoT before. I used to work in IoT 10, 15 years ago, and guess what happened in IoT? Like the early solutions were all point solutions. I found a device I can connect to the internet. I plumb the data quickly to something on the screen, and voila, there we go. Like that's my IoT solution. And what we've seen over time is the platforms took a little bit more time. They're complex. They carried a lot of extra complexity to be implemented correctly. But the platforms are actually what survived in the long run, right? If you think about your own home, right? If you experimented with IoT 10, 15 years ago, you would have found a solution for lights and for doorbells and for smoke sensors and for thermostats and what have you. And chances are, over time, you get tired of having 27 apps on your phone and nothing worked together, right? And you didn't really create a smart home. You created a connected home, but you were the monkey in the middle connecting and manipulating those 27 apps, right? So fast forward, the platform came in and the platform started to do smart things of when I open the door, the lights go on, right? Well, that took that extra level of orchestration across two domains to make that useful. That's what ultimately stuck around, right? And for those that experimented with point solutions, and I'm using an example that is relatable for people here, chances are if you did do that experiment, over time you ripped and replaced it with something that was more
Yeah,
useful.
I feel like you're describing my exact experience with IoT 10 years ago when I started getting all kinds of various things and nothing wanted to talk. Nothing talked to each other at all. It was
It's very
infuriating, and
frustrating, right?
it was
Because like,
very frustrating. It was terrible from from an experience perspective on the customer side.
and now imagine the same analogy in IoT in AI, right? So you're going to
Mhm.
solve a problem. You built your chatbot, you built your finance bot, you built your marketing prediction bot, you built all your different your workforce management bot, but nothing talks to each other.
Yeah.
right?
Well,
And
and it
then
becomes
upgrades come and technology dependencies come. It becomes a nightmare over time.
for sure. Yeah, definitely a nightmare to maintain for sure. And even more dangerous when things are just happening in the background that people may not even see because the agents are just off running, running processes and tasks in the background. And I,
And
I think this does.
that's an
Oh, sorry. Go
even
ahead.
yeah, that's a topic we haven't even discussed here, right? The other thing about agentic workloads is ultimately the governance part,
Hmm.
right? In order to do these things correctly, you need tight controls. You need permission-based rules. You need to make sure that these things are somewhat predictable in their outcomes, that they follow a set of well-established rules of the game, right? And if you don't do that, it's like hiring an intern and tell the intern, like, here's the credit card of the company, please don't abuse it, right? Like that's a bit dangerous, right? It may go well, it may go very bad, right? You want governance, right? And a platform establishes governance, right? Point solutions typically skip that. It does a
Mhm.
quick win. That wasn't important.
Well, that does actually lead me nicely into a question I wanted to ask, which is, it seems like this is where we're going with this, but when point solutions or bolt-on solutions start to escape out of out of that initial phase, I would imagine that's when it starts to become visible to leadership. And maybe it's a cost thing, maybe it's a customer experience thing, or does it just hit that operational wall and therefore, leadership has to become involved in order to kind of, bring things back to some level of sanity.
Yeah, and I think what I would recommend is, listen, we live in a very fast moving time. Like, experimenting is a good thing, right? And everybody should, and every leader should. By the time you experiment to prove an assumption, to validate a set of things that you think are correct, and that's why you experiment. By the time you've done your experiments and you've known these things to be true, you should start to think long term, right? Like, well, a point solution might be a quick win. At the end, what is much more frustrating, just like the IoT solution, is that you have to rip it out in 2 years from now and start over.
Hmm.
Right. And especially in anything in business, like we like to develop workflows and software that lasts, right? That will never need to be replaced. Right. And that just requires a long-term thinking, right? So you have to think about governance, you have to think about long term, right?
Hmm. Indeed.
And we've talked about some of the problems with AI and the implementation here. I want to talk a little bit about what we can do about said problems now. So you mentioned that it's not so much a strategy problem or an intent problem, but more of that architecture problem that we just talked about as well. For a
Yeah.
BSP, what does this mean for them?
So what a BSP needs to think about is, and this goes back to where we started, right? Very simple. Before you drown in complexity, is like, what are your key business objectives, right? What are you really focused on, right? What is your rate limiting step? Are you focused on customer acquisition? Is churn a problem? Is maximizing revenue per subscriber a problem? Uh, in reality, probably multiple of those things, some more urgent than others, right? But you should start to think comprehensively about all these factors. You should start to think about which ones are most urgent, but design for a strategy that ultimately expands to all those vectors, right? And if you do that, you very quickly find that, like, okay, if I want to design for, let's say, upsell from an unmet need support to an upsell flow, that means I need orchestration and I need trust, right? How do I get that care agent to identify an unmet need, then somehow work with a marketing agent to drive an offer, right? And then transact that with a billing agent to actually close on an offer, right? There's 3-4 steps from different departments that need to be seamlessly orchestrated to create a great experience, right? I call it the click to buy experience, right? If you see how web companies do this really well, right? They make an offer, right? And they can transact that offer immediately. Like when you see something you like we've all been spoiled by Amazon, right? You can click on something and you can check it out in 3 seconds or something like that, right? There's nothing more frustrating than a service provider that identifies an unmet need. Frank wants better internet because he's working from home. And as soon as I click on it, it basically says, call your service provider. Well, you just killed my productivity. I'm in the middle of a call with you guys. I don't want to commit an hour to talk to my service provider. I want to do
Hmm.
click to buy. Right. So you lost me because the chances that I'm going to call in an hour from now or 2 hours from now are just close to zero.
Yeah.
Right. So creating that frictionless experience, right, requires ultimately to transact all these different steps, which then demands orchestration, trust, federation, and all these things underneath.
Hmm.
That's
Right.
that's a
So it
great
all
example,
stitches
Gabe.
together.
Gabe and I talk about customer experience a lot
Yeah.
on the podcast, specifically that example with how easy it is to go to some of these other broadband service providers in the country. And then a few weeks ago, we talked about how you have these, call them tech companies, entering the space now as well. And they do an exceptional job about this. Gabe, the example I shared last week was a satellite provider that has a single page on their website now with a buy button, and you click buy, and it doesn't even take you to a new page. It's all done on that single page. So from a customer experience standpoint, Gabe and I love that conversation.
Yeah,
And I
absolutely.
think
Well,
that's where our industry will go. I think you will start to see uh, agentic workflows that will run in your favorite user experience, whether you talk to something or whether you're on a chatbot or whether you're on a web page or whatever your preferred method is, multimodal by design, you will get to a frictionless environment where that agent will just keep fetching the next step for you and not hand you over to somebody else because that kills experience.
mhm. It absolutely does. And frankly, I think it's going to kill businesses going forward. If businesses are not set up to do these transactions in a very, very efficient way, they're going to lose to potentially inferior products that are set up to do it in a very efficient way. And I do think that's a big risk for a lot of providers out there to, really think deeply about what does that experience look like for the customer. And as to your point, Frank, one click to buy becomes the standard expectation of every consumer. How do they leverage AI, proper AI solutions to be able to do that end to end?
Yep, I think you summarized it well.
Well, this is a topic Zach and I talk about a lot for sure. I just wanted to hit on a point here. For folks running companies, we obviously work with a large set of different types of customers. Some are PE backed, really competitive customers. Some are cooperatives serving different areas. Some are munis. But what should they be thinking about right now to avoid stranding AI investments later? What's that first conversation they need to have internally to make sure that they're not in this situation in the future?
Say the first thing they should do is they should take an inventory of all the business systems they have in their environment, their workforce management, their billing systems, their operational systems, like their ticketing systems. I would take an inventory of that, and then I would have the hard conversation about, like, if I fast forward 1, 2, 5 years, right? Like, can I imagine a workflow as we just were brainstorming that is seamless and all these systems will just magically do their thing, right? And I would start to ask the hard question, which of these systems will not play ball, right? And that's the tough conversation to be had because at the end of the day, like the chain is as strong as the weakest link, right? Like if there's one system in there, let's say the billing system, that doesn't do that seamless transaction, then the flow breaks. And now you're back to, we'll hand you off to an agent and have a nice day, right? So you'll need to go do that inventory. You'll need to go have the discussion with all of these vendors. The good news is there's great technology to do seamless handoffs between platforms. Right? It's not that everything needs to come from one vendor. We have things like A2As or agents talking to agents. We can exchange context from a billing system to a ticketing system to a provisioning system without ever losing that context, right? And that's net new technology that we didn't have 2 years ago, right? Back in the day, we would need to do API integrations, feed all of your data to my data lake and I can solve world hunger, right? Where somebody else said, no, you feed all your data to my data lake and I'll solve world hunger. Right? We don't need that anymore now. We can actually exchange context, right? But that's the first question I would ask is, do all your vendors that you have, are they aligned with that vision? Do they have a technology roadmap to facilitate that? If not, they're becoming a dead end in that stack.
I think you hit on something that makes us realize how rapidly this technology is changing. And you said back in the day, 2 years ago. And I love that you said it that way because it is such a perfect reminder of how rapidly all of this stuff is changing.
And 2 years ago, we couldn't even imagine what now is that obvious to anybody that's working on these type of solutions. There's no debate about how systems should integrate with each other. Everybody will tell you MCP and A to A. Well, a year ago, barely anybody could spell those terms. So we went from there's something brand new to yeah, of course we're going to do it that way. And the whole world is converging fast.
Gabe, the best example I have of this, I texted you about today, and I don't know if you remember this full context, but about a year ago or 2 years ago, back in the day, ChatGPT, OpenAI, they announced agent mode, which could kind of take control of a remote computer and do specific tasks. And one of the things I tasked it with doing was in a demo environment, creating a Facebook ad, analyzing those Facebook results. Just recently, Facebook has started to spin up their own MCP server, which you can integrate with Claude, OpenAI, your tool of choice, and extract that data, work with the data you have. You can engage and interact with those systems with that access across your data. And keep in mind, 2 years ago, we were using agent mode to do this. Now it's more directly integrated with the systems and the processes that you're used to, the tools you're familiar with.
Yeah, that's a great example.
Good example.
Frank, as we kind of wrap up here, though, if you could leave our listeners with one thing to take back to their leadership, or maybe a question that they should be asking about their AI strategy, what would that be?
What I would say is think big. Don't rush into a quick win, right? Think big. Think about where could this operation, where could this business be? Let's say if I had a blank sheet of paper, if I could redesign all my business processes, think big first and then work backwards to tangible steps, right? Because then you know that you're solving the right problem, right? As opposed to falling for the temptation of the quick win of, look at me, I built a chatbot in 3 days and you took 3 weeks. Well, that's really not the point. You need to design for the long game.
Absolutely. Well, Frank, thank you again for joining us on Buffering, and thank you for everyone for tuning in here today. If you enjoyed this episode, don't forget to follow us on your favorite podcast app and to share it with your friends and colleagues. And for more insights and updates, be sure to connect with us on LinkedIn.